I'm going to read a fascinating quote from an Awake article published by Jehovah's Witnesses, and I'd like for you to guess when it was written. If you are a young person, you also need to face the fact that you will never grow old in this present system of things. Why not? Because all the evidence and fulfillment of Bible prophecy indicates that this corrupt system is due to end in a few years. Of the generation that observed the beginning of the last days in 1914, Jesus foretold, "This generation will by no means pass away until all these things occur." Matthew 24, verse 34. Therefore, as a young person, you will never fulfill any career that this system offers. If you are in high school and thinking about a college education, it means at least 4, perhaps even 6 or 8 more years to graduate into a specialized career. But where will this system of things be by that time? It will be well on the way toward its finish, if not actually gone. When was the article written? Let's get into our time machine and look back at how many of these regional conventions, which used to be called district conventions, have passed since that Awake magazine was published. As you see the different annual programs, spot the one that was your last convention and post it in the comments. Still going. We're all the way back into the 90s now, over 20 years ago. We're in the last days, the 80s. When will this stop? The end is just around the corner. "1969. The quote from the beginning of the video was from an Awake published in 1969, May 22nd, 1969 to be exact. If someone was born in 1969, they would be 53 sometime in 2022. Now imagine those high school kids that read that back in 1969. They would have been 16 or 17 then? Today they would be approaching or in their 70s, and they were told to face the fact they would never grow old in this system of things, that they would never fulfill any career. In reality, they have had children, their children have grown up and have had children, and by now, their grandchildren have grown up and have had children of their own. Those that were promised would never grow old now have great-grandchildren. And still, the lie that Watchtower propagates continues. In light of this failed prediction, sadly only one of many from the Jehovah's Witnesses, let's see what the Bible has to say about this. First scripture is from Luke 21 and verse 8.
He said, "Look out that you are not misled, for many will come on the basis of my name, saying, 'I am he,' and 'the due time is near.' Do not go after them."
The second verse is from Deuteronomy 18, verse 21 and 22.
However, you may say in your heart, "How will we know that Jehovah has not spoken the word?" When the prophet speaks in the name of Jehovah, and the word is not fulfilled or does not come true, then Jehovah did not speak that word. The prophet spoke it presumptuously. You should not fear him.
When I was waking up from the Jehovah's Witnesses, I found comfort in those 2 verses, because I would get those anxiety attacks thinking, what if they're right? In the March 22nd, 1993 issue of The Awake, they attempted to address some of these false predictions. This is online on jw.org if you want to read it for yourself too. I'm going to read the footnote because there is a lot to unpack and it's filled with untruths, which I will prove from their own publications. Jehovah's Witnesses, in their eagerness for Jesus' second coming, have suggested dates that turned out to be incorrect. Does saying face the fact you will never grow old or never fulfill a career sound like a mere suggestion to you? It sounds absolute to me. Let's read the rest of the footnote and please notice the dates of the publications used. If they can reference 100-year-old articles and it isn't considered old light in their eyes, then we can do the same. Because of this, some have called them false prophets. Never in these instances, however, did they presume to originate predictions in the name of Jehovah. Never did they say these are the words of Jehovah. Anyone that knows anything about Jehovah's Witness doctrine knows full well that anything the governing body says is regarded to come from Jehovah and Jesus. The Watchtower, the official journal of Jehovah's Witnesses, has said, "We have not the gift of prophecy." January 1883, page 425. Nor would we have our writings reverenced or regarded as infallible. December 15th, 1896, page 306. The Watchtower has also said that the fact that some have Jehovah's Spirit does not mean those now serving as Jehovah's Witnesses are inspired. It does not mean that the writings in this magazine, The Watchtower, are inspired and infallible and without mistakes. May 15th, 1947, page 157. The Watchtower does not claim to be inspired in its utterances, nor is it dogmatic. August 15th, 1950, page 263. The brothers preparing these publications are not infallible. Their writings are not inspired, as are those of Paul and the other Bible writers. And so at times it has been necessary, as understanding became clearer, to correct views. February 15th, 1981, page 19. There is a lot to unpack there. But we can cut through all those excuses by answering one simple question. Have they ever claimed to be prophets? And by extension, would the words of Deuteronomy 18, verse 21 and 22 then apply to them? The October 1st, 1919 issue of the Watchtower had this to say: "Notice the cross on the Watchtower, and remember that 1919 date. It will come up again later." They needed to pivot and try to retcon their failed prediction of 1914 and Armageddon. Even their explanation turned out wrong, because the government, social, religious, and political worlds didn't end either. But now the time has come for the Elijah class to demonstrate. It has been reported that in 1914, the Baptist people in their annual gathering discussed the question of how they could get that man Russell. Finally, they said, he has been preaching that the world will end in October 1914. When that time comes and the world does not end, we will brand him as a false prophet and an impostor. They overlook the fact that our teaching was and is that it is not the physical earth that will end, but the governmental, social, religious, political world. In other words, the entire present order of things must give way to a new order of things. However, when in July 1914 the World War began, and by October 1914 all newspaper correspondents and great statesmen of the world were freely predicting that unless something happened to stop the war, civilization and Christianity would go down into revolution and anarchy, this shut up the mouths of those Baptist preachers so completely and so thoroughly that they have never dared to open their yoppers since. What had happened? The fire had come down, and just as the fire in the type of Elijah burned up not only the sacrifice, but the stones of the altar as well, so this fire will not stop until the whole of every unjust and autocratic institution is burned up and destroyed. This was the test, the coming down of fire, and the fulfillment exactly on time has proved that Pastor Russell was one of God's great reformers and prophets. Do you believe that? Well, let me tell you that the preachers believe it too, but are afraid to say so. Notice what they called Russell. Yes, one of God's great reformers and prophets. Let's jump to January 15, 1959 issue of the Watchtower. The end of paragraph 10 says, "Who will be Jehovah's prophet to the nations? To speak to them everything that he should command? Who will be the modern Jeremiah?" Jeremiah prophesied 40 years in the time of the end of the kingdom of Judah. So who will prophesy with his message in this time of the end of the nations of this world? Paragraph 13 continues, "The fact that decides the answer to the question is not, do all the clergy of Roman Catholicism and of Protestantism agree that Jehovah's Witnesses have been and are God's prophet to the nations? But who discerned the divine will for Christians in this time of the world's end and offered themselves to do it? Who have undertaken God's foreordained work for this day of judgment of the nations? Who have answered the call to the work and have done it down till this year 1958? Whom has God actually used as his prophet? Over the next page on paragraph 14, Jehovah's Witnesses are deeply grateful today that the plain facts show that God has been pleased to use them. It has been because Jehovah thrust out his hand of power and touched their lips and put his words in their mouths. Let's repeat that, for emphasis, as they would say. They compared themselves to the modern-day Jeremiah as Jehovah's prophets today, and that Jehovah put his words in their mouths. On to the July 15, 1960 issue, paragraph 19. Yes, the faithful and discreet slave was awake to the coming of 1914. In 1942, the faithful and discreet slave, guided by Jehovah's unerring spirit, made known that the democracies would win World War II and that there would be a United Nations organization set up. Such wakefulness was concerning events that unerringly took place 3 years later. At the 1958 Divine Will International Assembly, amazing advance information in connection with Daniel's prophecy was given about events to occur in the immediate future. Such evidence of spiritual foresight is recorded for us in the book, Your Will Be Done on Earth. Once again, the faithful and discreet slave has been tipped off ahead of time for the guidance of all lovers of God. Surely one's present security depends on his staying awake with the faithful and discreet slave. Here they claim that the faithful and discreet slave, what the governing body calls themselves, are guided by Jehovah's unerring spirit, and that they have spiritual foresight and are tipped off ahead of time. More and more, that article from 1993 seems like a bunch of cherry-picked lies. In the future, I can make a video if anyone is interested about their so-called prophecy in 1942, about the UN being set up. In short, the UN announced their formation beforehand. Anyone that could read the news was aware of the UN. It wasn't a secret. Just because the UN wasn't formally created and didn't have its charter ratified until 1945 doesn't mean Jehovah's Witnesses predicted it 3 years in advance. Fast forward April 1st, 1972, this article says, "A third way of coming to know Jehovah God is through his representatives. In ancient times, he sent prophets as his special messengers. While these men foretold things to come, they also served the people by telling them of God's will for them at that time, often also warning them of dangers and calamities. People today can view the creative works. They have at hand the Bible, but it is little read or understood. So does Jehovah have a prophet to help them, to warn them of dangers and declare things to come?" Identifying the prophet. These questions can be answered in the affirmative. Who is this prophet? Over to the other side of the page. He had a prophet to warn them. This prophet was not one man, but was a body of men and women. It was the small group of footstep followers of Jesus Christ, known at that time as International Bible Students. Today they are known as Jehovah's Christian Witnesses. Some JW apologists might claim now that perhaps the organization meant they were only prophets in the sense that they helped people read the Bible and warn them of dangers and things that were going to happen based on the Bible. But who alone in the organization is permitted to interpret what is going to happen according to the Bible? Isn't it the faithful and discreet slave, the governing body? Let's jump ahead now to 1986. If you were a JW then, you would know how excited they were when the UN declared 1986 to be the International Year of Peace. Many were expecting the cry of peace and security. Spoiler alert, nothing happened. Anyways, the March 15, 1986 Watchtower, in the article entitled "Allow No Place for the Devil," on paragraphs 14 and 15 had this to say: "Finally, we might consider what the Society has published in the past on chronology. Some opposers claim that Jehovah's Witnesses are false prophets. These opponents say that dates have been set, but nothing has happened. Again, we ask, what is the motive of these critics? Are they encouraging wakefulness on the part of God's people, or are they rather trying to justify themselves for falling back into sleepy inactivity? What is their motivation? What an absurd question. If you discover that someone was selling a map that had completely wrong directions, wouldn't you want to inform others about it? This article shows the type of mental walls JWs are reinforced to raise as soon as someone criticizes the organization. If someone points out all their failed predictions and changed dates, JWs are instructed to ask, what is their motive, and then to shift the blame onto the person pointing out the lies, rather than the one making all the false prophecies in the first place. And today, the governing body tells Jehovah's Witnesses not to even speak to apostates. They probably figured out these so-called apostates know more about the religion than their own members do. Paragraph 15 makes a bold assertion. Yes, Jehovah's people have had to revise expectations from time to time. Because of our eagerness, we have hoped for the new system earlier than Jehovah's timetable has called for it. But we display our faith in God's word and its sure promises by declaring its message to others. Moreover, the need to revise our understanding somewhat does not make us false prophets, or change the fact that we are living in the last days, soon to experience the great tribulation that will pave the way for the earthly paradise. What does making predictions and then changing dates make you, if anything, besides a false prophet? They can't shed the responsibility of all their failed dates just because they don't want to be called a false prophet. It doesn't work that way. If they didn't want to be called a false prophet, maybe they shouldn't have been making false predictions. The paragraph then continues with this statement. How foolish to take the view that expectations needing some adjustment should call into question the whole body of truth. Might I remind you that Jehovah's Witnesses wrote in their reasoning book on page 323 under religion, would you be happy to drink a glass of poisoned water because someone assured you that most of what you were getting was water? Boom, mic drop. Now onto the Revelation book, page 164. Here they specifically equate the two witnesses who prophesy as faithful anointed Christians. In the January 1st, 2013 edition of the Watchtower, they printed more flimsy excuses for their failed predictions. In the box, have Jehovah's Witnesses given incorrect dates for the end? The box says that their wrong expectations are similar to Jesus' first-century disciples, who looked forward to the fulfillment of prophecies ahead of God's timetable. They cite 3 scriptures. Most Jehovah's Witnesses would see the Bible verses and assume, okay, it must be legit. Free pass to the organization. But let's look at those 3 verses. Do they actually show Jesus' disciples making any false predictions or giving any false dates? Nothing like that at all. Luke 19 verse 11 simply states that they thought the kingdom of God was going to appear. They didn't preach to everyone that it was going to. In Acts 1 verse 6, they simply asked Jesus a question. They didn't go preaching that he was going to restore Israel. And finally, 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 1 and 2 ironically applies to themselves the most. It's completely self-incriminating. It says, not to be quickly shaken from your reason, nor to be alarmed either by an inspired statement or by a spoken message, or by a letter appearing to be from us, to the effect that the day of Jehovah is here. Now, what organization does that describe perfectly? Jehovah's Witnesses. The governing body repeatedly states that Jehovah and Jesus trust them, so Jehovah's Witnesses should trust the governing body.
The plain truth is that we cannot say that we trust in Jehovah if we do not trust in his earthly representatives, those whom Jehovah trusts. Today, Jehovah leads the earthly part of his organization by means of the faithful and discreet slave.
We know the Master Jesus found the faithful and discreet slave spiritually feeding right-hearted ones in 1919. And at a future time will appoint him over all his belongings. So what's the implication? Obviously, even now, Jesus fully trusts the faithful slave.
Although there is no divine inspiration today, still Jesus leads his people progressively through the services of the faithful slave. Jesus trusts that the imperfect faithful slave will do its best to convey spiritual food. Do you also trust the slave?
But that's circular reasoning, and they have proven that they can't be trusted, and they couldn't possibly be speaking for God, because Jehovah would have never given them false prophecies to relate. From the very first issue of Zion's Watchtower, in 1879, they have been saying we are living in the last days. Why would you obey someone that admits they are not inspired, not infallible, continually change their doctrine, and have gotten their predictions all wrong? Look behind the curtain. Use your critical thinking skills. Think about when Jehovah's Witnesses were prohibited from getting vaccinations, organ transplants, or blood fractions. How many died needlessly following the directions of the governing body? What prevents them from suddenly getting more new light about the blood doctrine? Why would you risk your life listening to someone that has a proven track record of doctrinal flip-flops? For those keeping count, these last days have been going on for 143 years and counting. So the next time you see a JW Broadcasting video saying we're living in the last days, or a Watchtower article at the end is imminent, remember the Bible's warnings and articles like the one from the 1969 Awake, where kids were told to face the fact that they would never grow old in this present system of things.